If you're here, I'd assume that you've either heard of or played the masterpiece of a game known as Metaphor ReFantazio. Metaphor ReFantazio. Metaphor ReFantazio? Would I also be right to assume that you've probably just accepted that as the title of this game and given it no further thought? Well, no worries, I've done the thinking for us and deciphered the meaning of this game's title. And spoiler, it means way more than you'd think and actually ends up being a completely core element to this game's narrative and perfectly packages up the messaging and theming of this game. Let's discuss. To start, let's unpack what Metaphor ReFantazio means. You see, the actual title of this game is meant to convey more to us than we may think upon first glance. In other words, more profundity went into this than is typical of video game titles. As you may know, the term metaphor is defined as something that represents or symbolizes another thing. As for ReFantazio, let's break that down. The prefix re means back or again, and its meaning can vary depending on the word that follows. In the context of this game, we can interpret it as suggesting concepts like reinvent or reconstruct or reincarnate. Fantazio is Esperanto for the word fantasy. If we consider all of this in the context of the lore of this game, specifically how the world before is our world, we can glean that the title of this game says that this is our world reconstructed or reincarnated through fantasy. Let's go deeper. If you don't know, Esperanto is essentially a made-up language created in 1887 that was intended to be used internationally but ended up getting very little use. The word Esperanto itself means one who hopes. If you're curious who created Esperanto, well, so was I, and discovered that its primary creator was a man named L.L. Zamenhof. This ended up being the right trail to follow because it turns out Zamenhof's story clearly served, at least in part, as inspiration for the narrative of Metaphor ReFantazio. You see, Zamenhof grew up in the Polish city of Białystok, and in a letter to a Russian professor and journalist Nikolai Borovko, Zamenhof revealed what it was like. Now, I'll paraphrase for clarity, but in the letter, Zamenhof said, "The place where I was born and spent my childhood gave direction to all of my future struggles. In Białystok, the inhabitants were divided into 4 distinct elements: Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews. Each of these spoke their own language and looked on all the others as enemies. In such a town, you can feel acutely the misery caused by language division and see that the diversity of languages is the first or most influential basis for the separation of the humans into groups of enemies. I was brought up as an idealist. I was taught that all people were brothers, but outside in the street, at every step, I felt that there were no people, only Russians, Poles, Germans, Jews, and so on." And so, we can glean from this scenario how Zamenhof grew inspired to create the language of Esperanto. He saw tribal division, he saw different groups of people struggling to coexist in an equitable way, and Esperanto was his vision to lessening division amongst humans. Of course, the main benefit of constructed language is that everyone is more equal. Everyone learns it. To clarify, for example, if I speak English and somebody who is a native speaker of Japanese learns English just to communicate with me, that is not an equitable process. At least one party is making more concessions than the other. But with a constructed language like Esperanto, there are no parties who are native speakers, so to speak, meaning the language Esperanto represents true, authentic equality. Remind you of anything? Let's zoom out from these details now and piece this thing together. We can now clearly conclude that it was a deliberate choice to have the language of Esperanto utilized in the title of this game, because outside of the word Esperanto literally meaning one who hopes, which we could apply to multiple characters in the story, the language itself is a language that was created purely for the ideal of a world without discrimination, a world of equality. And the entire narrative of Metaphor ReFantazio is about how you pursue said world. In other words, in the entire narrative of Metaphor ReFantazio, you are on a journey that parallels the founder of the language, Esperanto. You are lucid to the world's injustice and ardently pursue a path to fix it. If all of this isn't enough evidence for you that the game's title featuring the Esperanto language is meant to convey to us deeper meanings that holistically represent Metaphor ReFantazio's story, then let me tell you what else I found out. You know the chanting that happens in many of the game's premiere songs? That chanting, those words, are actually from the Esperanto language. And as we know, it's straight up conveyed to us early on in the game that the music we hear in the game is actually a spell cast by Gallica.
I can at least cast my usual spell for you. It's the small comforts, right?
Right.
Music was the first magic this world ever knew, after all. Makes the road a little easier. Look! Over there! Let's go.
So that music that is motivating the protagonist throughout the story, during all of his epic battles and throughout his exploration of the world, the music played by Gallica, a fairy whose age is likely to span centuries given their nigh immortality, yeah, that's literally the language of Esperanto ringing in the protagonist's ears. That makes me wonder if in Atlus's vision for this game, if things were meant to go a step further, if they're literally implying that in the world of Metaphor ReFantazio, that Zamenhof may have created the language of Esperanto in this context, with the help or even tutelage of fairies. After all, the world before in this game is a world that perfectly mirrors ours. In fact, it's heavily implied that it is literally our world. To expound upon this really quickly, we get the majority of our evidence through the opening segment of the game. The graphic displayed is clearly our world, and we're asked to give our real name as a person separate to the player, and Moore states that he's reaching us from a different world. To be more clear, what he actually means and what the story is actually telling us is that he's communicating to us from the future. He clues us in when he says, "My entire world is but the dawn of a story yet untold." On your first playthrough, you may think he just means you haven't played the game yet, but once you understand the lore of the world before, and you understand that Moore spent a great deal of time at the Elding Sanctum and was aware of all of its secrets, you can glean that he's deduced where we are from and understands it to be a different point in time, the world before. Now, to connect back to the idea of Zamenhof literally creating the language of Esperanto and Metaphor ReFantazio with the help of fairies, we know that in the world of Metaphor ReFantazio that the most significant change agents or reformers across its history are always accompanied by a fairy companion. You, the protagonist, have Gallica, and the legendary hero king had Agrica. If we're assuming Metaphor's world before is our world, who's to say in this narrative that Zamenhof wasn't guided by fairies as well? His language being used so deliberately in the game, and the narrative going out of its way to make it clear to you that the music is a spell cast by Gallica and actually being heard by the protagonist in-universe, it really makes me want to believe that this is what they were going for. And I know we're several layers deep and it may feel like a reach, but I think there's enough evidence to assume this was the writer's intention. In a prior video, I said that it would take multiple playthroughs or a good amount of time with this game to truly understand the amount of layers that went into this game's narrative. Having discovered all of this, I feel like that's true now more than ever. Thank you so much for watching. If you have a moment, please comment your thoughts below. The main reason I make these videos is to build community and connect with other people who love or have an interest in video games. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and drop a like, as it will really help in the long run for us to build our community here where we can have our healthy discussions. Check out some other videos on my channel for more content like this. Have a great day, night, or morning, and remember to be kind and thoughtful. Peace.
But consider, if fantasy is born from hope, a desire to make the world better than it is, then that hope can be made manifest. Thus does change come, and thus is fantasy forged into a new reality. Perhaps the story about to unfold before you will tell us. I'm thoroughly invested now myself, so let this tale begin.